Welcome to Darklaw Dominion, where we dive deep into the shadows, the darkest parts of ourselves that we rarely speak of, yet we all feel. I'm your host, Dominion, and in this series, we're not afraid to face the raw truths of our mental health, the battles that rage within, and the weight we carry when no one else is watching. This is where we confront the fears, the pain, the trauma we hide, and uncover the power that lies within the darkness. Because only by facing it can we truly heal and rise. Let's take this journey together. Welcome to the depths of Darklaw Dominion.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Create Dominion podcast with your host, Dominion, and welcome to episode 12 of the season 2 of the Darklaw Dominion Mental Health series. I'm joined by a wonderful guest on the West Coast, Mrs. Jen Canobbio from over the hills in the Bay Area, again, all the way on the West Coast of the United States. Here joined with her on this wonderful episode to really teach and really educate on a topic that just for your host Dominion is really near and dear to my heart as being a single father of twin boys. And so for all you listeners and viewers out there that have kids or are around kids or, go to the grocery store. If you go to the grocery store, you've seen kids. So this is for everyone. And so before we really get started into the topic here today, I'll let Jen go ahead and introduce yourself. How are you today?
I am doing really well. Thanks for having me. I am, like you said, Jen Canobbio. In California, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've really worked in every setting with youth and families over a very extensive career, spanning a little bit over 3 decades now. About 11 years ago, went into private practice. And throughout my career, and certainly as I became a mom, I've got 2 adolescents of my own. One's just started college and the other's in high school. And as they were starting school and what I was seeing with a growing mental health crisis with youth in this country, I became this huge proponent of earlier intervention, right? And teaching social emotional curriculums in school, teaching kids how to be more resilient, how to develop healthier coping skills, develop some self-awareness, some social skills, communication skills. Our schools don't teach that stuff. And these are important life skills. So during the pandemic, of course, lockdown, there was a lot of missed developmental milestones for our youth because that growth is so rapid. So 2 years of really no social interaction, no school settings. It took a pretty big hit. And I didn't see it as much during the pandemic in my practice with youth, right? That stayed kind of, there's always a need. Therapists had just ridiculous waiting lists during the pandemic, But post-pandemic, going back to school, the amount of social anxiety, the amount of avoidance, panic attacks, suicidal ideation, all of these things were actually increasing as I was seeing this with my kids' peers, as well as in my practice and statistics nationwide. So I decided it was time to get off my soapbox and stop preaching about it and actually put together a program that's not therapy. It's designed to be more proactive to help parents really be able to connect with their youth by giving their youth the ability to understand what's happening to them and manage it far more effectively.
Awesome. And again, so excited to really dig into this episode because regardless of if you have children or not, like I mentioned in the intro, is really, this impacts, the future leaders and citizens of America. And so, like I said, even if you don't have kids, you're going to be around a kid that's going to turn into an adult soon, as long as they have a breath and live. And so this is really an episode to every, human on the planet, essentially. Because again, we all were children at one point. We all have certain, diaphragms within our mind. I always call it the confirmation bias on how we think based on, again, like Jen was saying, how we're raised. And before we really get deep into it and kind of break down what she said in her biography, if you will, really want everyone to really slow down really fast. And as we get into the episode, I just want every listener and viewer to just take one thing that's said here today. Like I said, you may not have kids, you may not like kids, you may not want anything to do with kids, or you may be a parent like me, or you may, like you say, you might be in social work, you might be a school teacher, You might be a volunteer worker at the foster care center in your town, whatever metric of the spectrum that you fall under. I really want everyone here just to take one thing that's said here today that you can apply tomorrow. And so as we dive deep into the darkest parts of our mind to reveal the true light that shines in this episode, I just want everyone listening and viewing to really take that into consideration. And so with that said, really just to break down really quick before we get into our first question on what you said, I love how you said, get off the soapbox and really develop a program. I hope you guys caught what she said when she was going through her background, because just not even just in podcasting, but we see social media, you see, whether it's Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, whatever, or X or whatever, we see so many you can call them, motivational speakers, or we see so much. I kind of call it like, it's kind of like dessert, it's kind of just like filler. It's a movie, a TV, a video on social media. We kind of see that like powerful, like, punch in the gut motivational speech, or that who we used to call it in marketing, conferences, we used to call it the hoorah speech, like you said, she said soapbox, but really essentially it's just, over time we just hear so much, hey, that sounds good, whether it's weight loss, like just get up, go to the gym and do your, hour workout every day. Great, I'm going to do it tomorrow. But what happens when, Wednesday comes and you've done it for 2 days and, your best friends are like, hey, let's go out for a drink because the appetizers are half off today. And then now you're at Applebee's somewhere eating appetizers, and it's like, well, I'll go to the gym tomorrow. And then Thursday comes and it's like, hey, you forgot it was your best friend's birthday. Oh, we're going to go, shoot some pool or go to bowling. It's like, oh, okay, well, I'll go with them. I'll just go Friday. Friday comes, it's like, oh, you got to work late. Well, I'll just go Monday because I'm busy this weekend. And then now you stop going to the gym. And I just wanted to use that quick analogy because it's similar to what she was saying, and it's not just, professionals. It could be anybody on social media. We hear, hey, just go get healing. Mental health matters, especially think about it for the children's perspective, the video games, the instant gratification that social media, the dopamine hit that social media provides, especially in not just for us as adults, but really if you look at the youth, what the clothes they're wearing, for the, what makeup they're wearing, how their hairstyle is, the music they listen to, everything in life has an influence, especially for the youth. And I really want to commend Jen really quickly just on, she could have just, and it's not bashing people that use motivation or use that as a tool to get through. It's not what I'm saying, but what really Jen noticed is there's a difference between, I call it commitment versus conviction. And so what she's saying is, hey, you're on the soapbox, you're helping kids, you've been helping kids for years, you're motivating them, you're helping them cope or get through. But one word that she used during her background is the word proactive. And I really want the audience to understand that word proactive. And what she meant by that is really just, hey, building a roof before it rains. Don't wait until you, try to take your own life or something morbid happens and now you're rushing frantically to kind of get help, or somebody falls off the cliff mentally. Really get to that proactive state. And she became convicted on helping the youth and said, hey, what can I do in my profession with my expertise to not only motivate people, but how can I help them before they even get to the point of needing motivation? And so as I ask you this first question, I really just want you guys to really take in that consideration of, hey, are you really committed to your, especially for those with parents on here, are you really committed to the future of your children, or are you convicted? And so there's a big difference with that. And so with that being said, Jen, what inspired you and motivated you the most to one, start, the field of helping the youth, but also really continue and become, kind of one of the best at what you do?
That is a multi-layered answer that I won't bore you and your audience with too much detail. Long story short, I think it's something like 90% of therapists in the field got into the field after their own healing journey, right? Because they experienced trauma. I'm actually part of that very small percentage that was super blessed to have an amazingly supportive, insightful, attuned family. I was raised by a mom who was really a social worker at heart, just didn't have the label. She believed in paying everything forward. We had blessings, we didn't need a bunch of stuff, right? Our life was very comfortable, but whatever we could spare, it was about helping the community. It was about helping, things at a national level. She would help on an international level. She was a part of boards, ranging from the arts to the homeless, right? And from a young age, got my brother and I very involved. So I always had that really as my original mindset, right? That I get to take my blessings and pay it forward. I started working with youth as a teenager, camp counselor, volunteering, babysitting, all that kind of stuff. And where other people would get really frustrated working with kids and youth, it just came naturally to me. So when I graduated from college, I wanted to take a little bit of a breather before grad school. I didn't really know what social work was. It was a term I'd heard once in a class in a movie. It was like sensible shoes, welfare office kind of a thing. But I got a job working in residential treatment with severely emotionally disturbed kids as young as 5 that were suicidal and homicidal because of the extent of the trauma they experienced. I actually went home and would cry for like the first 3 weeks because the job was so hard and so intense. I did not know what I was stepping into, but it was the best learning ground. And that was really what started my journey of working with youth and families that had experienced a lot of trauma, usually generational trauma. And like I said, I've worked in pretty much every possible setting. If I can work with these acting out youth that are running away, they're experimenting with drugs, they're physically aggressive, they're getting kicked out of school, right? Those were my kids. Those were my people. And my colleagues would call me the teen whisperer, and they would send me all the cases that were too much for them, that they couldn't have an impact with. And, I don't have a magic wand. What I have is an ability to connect, to attune, and to give them actual tools and actually have the tools myself to promote healing that my clients get tremendous results, and they have for years. So when it, I'm watching things really kind of continue to fall apart, I'm watching the impact around me and nationally and worldwide, really, um, reading all these statistics, seeing these kids come to my therapy office disclosing at 12, right, that some guy on the internet convinced them to take a nude and now it's gone viral, right? So that creates tremendous trauma. If they had known what was happening to them, if they had known how to identify those warning signs, because the reality is adolescents aren't going to talk to their parents about everything. If they are, those parents probably need to check their boundaries a little bit and not focus so much on being their kids' BFF. But kids will tell us some things, but they aren't going to tell us everything because nature is trying to help them pull away from us so that they don't die when they go out into the wild on their own. So it's really important that we make sure that we're helping them curate the voices that they're listening to and the information that they're taking in, if we want to help them make healthy choices and understand what's happening so that they can harness really the power and the potential that the adolescent stage is really defined for, because it's setting us up to be successful as adults, to be healthy as adults. And when we don't have the tools, when we don't understand what's happening, then we fall into all these pitfalls. We believe all of the stereotypes, right? And we end up reinforcing negative self-perceptions, negative coping skills, and that's how we're setting them up to really struggle well into adulthood. I have adults in my therapy practice, and what do we end up doing? 99% of the time, we're going back and we're healing what was happening not just in their childhood, but the self-perception that was really hardwired during their adolescent stage.
I love that you said that. Again, I hope you guys are really listening and honing in on what she's saying. So, one thing I want to say to the parents really quick before I break that down is, like she said, they call her the teen whisperer. And so, if you're a parent and you have one of those kids, that maybe they ran away from home, maybe they started smoking pot or doing drugs or self-harm or physically punching holes in walls, etc. Just know that again, you're not alone, and hope is not lost. You really have to, again, going back to what we said before I asked the question, are you committed? Are you convicted of, hey, I'm going to help my child through what they need help with? And on what she said about, not telling parents everything, I really want to tell the parents as well, too. There's difference between helping your child and carrying your child through. It's two different things. And so you do have to allow your child some independence to heal on their own. And you give them those tools and walk with them on how to navigate that. I always, it's so many different comparisons, but I would similar to taking an SAT exam to prepare for college. You're not gonna hold their hand and walk with them in the classroom and get the little peppermints and sit. You're not gonna sit, have them sit in your lap and hold the pencil for them and circle the little bubbles and raise your hand to use the restroom. Right. And so, similar to that, you're gonna, you buy the book, or you give them the book. If they have any questions, you give them set them up with a schedule to study, or you pay for practice exams, and then hey, you know, May 1st at 9 a.m. in room 105 in the high school. You're gonna go there. You're gonna take the test for 3 hours. You're at work or you're off or you're doing your own thing. There's no phones obviously during a test. They take the test. You get the results in a couple weeks. And then that's it. Similar to, helping them heal. You're going to use the books as kind of like the tools. You're going to give them the tools. You're going to be there to support them. But again, you have to let them walk that walk for themselves. And I just think that, especially for parents, a lot of times we try to hold on too much to the child's trauma and really try to baby step it. And then we get mad when, like Jen said, when they don't tell us everything. Well, hey, they're trying to work, they're trying to heal it for themselves. And so there's so much you said there. I'd love for you to break that down.
Well, I actually want to reply to something you just said. Again, it's nature. It isn't personal. And this is something that parents really struggle with because it feels so personal to them during the interactions. But the way that their brain is developing, it's what we would say bottom up. So it's going through that survival response. It's going through that very emotional part of the brain and then finding its way up to that more rational part of the brain. And because nature is saying, find a new tribe, find ways to survive away from your parents. And because it is so, there's that hair trigger for that big survival instinct, even though there's no saber-tooth tiger there, right? Mom and dad are just saying, how was your day? And they're like, why did I get such a big disrespectful? Because how they're receiving that information has to go through that filter. So if they're already stressed, if they're already, a little emotionally activated, mom and dad are the safe people. So they're going to get the brunt of that big reaction. And it isn't that our voice doesn't matter. Again, I have 2 adolescents. I get it. Parenting adolescents is such an important and challenging job because we have to find that balance. And it's not a constant state, right? It's a constant shift between helping them become more independent and making sure that we're still that safety net because their world is shifting and changing daily. Their brain is literally developing daily for a decade and a half. So they don't trust themselves yet. They don't trust their world around them. They're taking these chances because that's helping them grow. But they need us to be that predictable, safe, steady spot. And that's hard to do when a kid is pushing against you. So parents have to really work on their own tools to manage the big emotions that tend to get triggered too. But we invest in people to teach our kids how to drive, right? The state, at least in California, you actually have to do that for a certain number of hours. Why? Because we know that they're going to hear it better from somebody other than mom and dad. How many parents are like, I'm not teaching them to drive. I'm done with that, right? Because their kid is struggling to hear them, and that's dangerous. We invest in their coaching. We invest in tutoring. We invest in them learning, a musical instrument, whatever. But we don't think to invest in actually their development. And that's dangerous.
Well, I love everything you said there. And again, I hope you guys are really paying attention because, she's dropping a lot of just different, tangible facts and really, breaking it down for us. Especially, I know for parents out there, you're like, wow, I didn't even really think. And I kind of, want to compare what she's saying is similar to you being the GPS for your child. How many times, I'm guilty, how many times we put the GPS on just to see if we can beat the time, or hey, we already know the route. We're just putting the GPS on to see, and we take that detour that we think that we always take. And then what does the GPS always do? It reroutes. And so sometimes you just have to be there as a guide to reroute your child. And one thing I want to say on the rerouting is sometimes when we take that shortcut we think is good, sometimes when we reroute the destination, it turns orange or red because there's construction and now we have a delay. And I want Jen to kind of break that down because we've all seen where we think we're taking a shortcut, but we forgot there might be construction on the highway and now we're stuck. And so I kind of want her to break that down real quick.
Okay. I mean, I like that analogy because I tell parents all of the time, you need to get your butt out of the driver's seat and into the passenger seat. You are there to guide, you're there to help them navigate. You are not there to keep driving them, right? And adolescence is such a really long period, which is why I think of it in kind of three stages of adolescence. So you've got like that maybe 10 to 13-year-old range. Now, you're going to stay in the driver's seat. You're going to drive your 10-year-old to middle school. But they're still needing to start to develop the tools because what do most people say? Middle school is the worst stage. Everybody is really getting thrown into adolescence. They don't have the tools. It's kind of the first sense of change that they have moving into a slightly less structured environment than they had in elementary school. So there is a lot to that being a really bumpy transition and them needing more from mom and dad. And for mom and dad to start bringing in where are those resources? How do we start building that toolbox? Then you've got kind of what I consider the high school age. So like 14 to 17 to 18 or roughly, right? That's when mom and dad need to start saying, okay, this is how this works, right? And again, these are some of the resources because I know I can start to sound like Charlie Brown's teacher, right? And we don't want to just fall on deaf ears. We want teens are going to naturally go find other voices. So it's going to be voices on the internet. It's going to be maybe some of their knuckleheaded friends. It has the potential of going sideways really, really fast. So we want to make sure that we're helping to curate those voices, right? We can't really control what our kids hear, but we can greatly influence what they're hearing when we are providing those voices to join us in helping them navigate, right? It's not either or. Parents are still the primary teachers, they're still the primary support, but we need to be expanding their worlds beyond mom and dad, or they're not going to function when it's time to leave home, whether that's college or a job, the military, whatever that is. Why do so many join the military? Because the military steps in to keep telling them what to do and when to do it because they haven't developed that themselves. That's why a lot of 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds are joining the military. So we want to be sure that we are gradually stepping back, but we're not going to feel safe to do that if we don't see that they're actually learning what to do when they do make a mistake. How do they navigate some of those social pressures? Will they come to us if there is indeed, a crisis? The more consistent we are, the more we ensure that they have good communication skills and we're good listeners, the more likely they'll actually come to us when there's a problem. But we can't foresee where that GPS is going to take them all of the time, right? All we can do is give them the best GPS system that we can invest in.
Awesome, awesome. I love everything that you just broke down because again, I hope she's breaking some barriers for the parents out there that are just like, I don't know what to do, with my teenager or my adolescents or however. And one thing she did say that really stuck out to me is really understanding. And again, she said it, and I really want the listeners and viewers to hone in. She said, you're not going to always know the destination. And I think that's the one of the biggest points that she made is because a lot of times, and I will just really quickly break this down, just for adults that are listening, how many times, and this goes right to my confirmation bias, how many times did you just look back to your adolescence, your, middle school, high school, even at 18 and up, how many times have you wanted to try something new, try a new instrument, try a new sport, try a new diet, try anything, and your parents said, oh, I tried that, or I did something like that when I was your age, it didn't work, you shouldn't do that, it's dumb, like, you're wasting your time, like, you don't need to be a cheerleader, like, just play in a band, or you don't need to play you don't need to join the football team, just, get good grades, go to college, because I should have went to college when I was your age, and all that stems from everything that Jen is talking about. It's all, that's why I love the word confirmation bias, because it's all in the mentality of what your parents went through when they were adolescents. Again, like Jen said, the tools, they didn't have the tools. They weren't given the tools to navigate that when they were young. And so the first experience they had, maybe they joined the football team and the first practice, they got hit so hard they threw up and the coach said, you're out of the game, and they never got to play again. Or maybe they, wanted to join a cheerleading squad, and the girl on the cheerleader, the leader, the captain of the cheer squad was a bully and didn't like them because their hair was blonde and pushed them down when they tried to do the triangle. And so every time they see cheerleading, they said, whenever I have a kid or whenever I have a daughter, I don't want them to cheerlead because I don't want them to be hurt like I was. And
It's always good intentions, right? I've never met a parent that doesn't love their kid, doesn't want the best for their kid, doesn't want better for their kid than what they had. But what do parents do? We tell them what they should or shouldn't do. And that falls on deaf ears because, again, nature, survive. I have to try this out for myself in order to be sure, right? But because maybe that my situation is different. Maybe I'll be better at that. Maybe I won't get caught up in that, whatever. So it isn't that our words of wisdom aren't important, but we have to get good at knowing when and how to offer them and to reinforce that with actual concrete skills and tools, right? I've heard people say, I was a teenager, I survived my teenage years, but I can't tell you how many people are like, I can't believe I survived my teenage years. And the reality is we do want better for our kids than ourselves. We muddled through it, we figured it out, but sometimes with some expense. And don't we want better for our kids? People talk a lot about healing their inner child. And I do that work with my clients, right? But the reality is, my inner child is really happy. My inner child is secure, happy, joyful. My inner teenager, not always. She gets insecure, right? She's still second guesses. She still assumes she's being judged because that's what the teenage brain is helping them do to survive. It doesn't make it accurate. So when they have that perspective and when they have the tools to manage all of that, guess what? They're not going to be my age saying, ooh, that inner teenager is still holding me back. And not to mention, because that teenage brain does want them to find power and purpose. And, they don't have a lot of dopamine naturally. They have a lot less than adults. So what do? They get these big spikes when they do something, novel and exciting, whether that's on social media, whether that's gossiping, whether that's shopping, whether that's junk food, whether that's, driving too fast on the freeway, right? They're looking for those dopamine hits, but we get to help to teach them how to do that in healthier ways so that they're not putting themselves at risk.
Yeah. Again, everything you're saying is just, on the ball. And one thing to kind of go with what you said is the word awareness. Being aware we always used to say or read in the room, like, okay, this my and to like help parents through that, just like your kids don't, tell us everything. As parents, we don't always need to share every experience. Both negative and positive that we went through. Again, awareness and reading the room. For example, if I know we just kind of got through the NFL draft and we saw Deion Sanders' son, kind of get thrown to the fifth round, and we all thought he was going to be expecting him to be, like his dad and be a first round, pick and be all, the top pick, one of the top picks. And that kind of goes to what we're talking about is, in a similar situation, if you got a son, if you're a parent, you got a son playing football and maybe you were all American, when you were in high school, but if they didn't make the team or if they're riding the bench, maybe, when they're kind of upset and they come home and they're not starting on the varsity, it's probably not the best time to talk about your high school state championships when they're kind of sitting on their bed, down, or vice versa. Maybe you were on the bench and then maybe you were a cheerleader as the mom and maybe you never got to be on top of the pyramid that they made with the pom-poms, but your daughter, she just got voted the captain of the cheer squad, when she comes home excited and, excited for practice tomorrow, now's not the time to say, well, when I was your age, I didn't make it or I was at the bottom or I wasn't good enough. So again, just reading the room and really using that awareness factor. And so like I said, again, so many great, words of wisdom thus far. And so really next, I know you talked about the first two stages. I really want you to kind of break down that last stage of adolescence. And again, I know we talked about this, off record, but, I really love this stage because until I, had connected with you, I had no idea this stage exists. And so I'll let you roll through, what that stage is and kind of what to look for those of you, some of you are on this, listening or viewing that are in this stage right now. And so I'd love for you to kind of break down that third stage of adolescence and kind of, some of the tools that you can use to navigate.
Well, 18 to 19 is sort of the start of that last stage of adolescence. Most people I mean, legally, right? 18 is an adult, right? 18, I can join the military and carry an automatic weapon. I can get married, I can vote. So suddenly at 18, we have all of this power and responsibility. But in the last couple of decades, what we've learned is the brain is not done growing. So the brain isn't finished growing, and that rational reason, where our morality is, our problem solving skills, our creativity, that's all in the prefrontal cortex, right? And that's not done developing until between the ages of 24 to 26. So one of the things that part of the brain is so important for is what we call executive functioning, our ability to start a task and see it through step by step to completion, right? Drives parents nuts in high school, for instance. I know my kid worked on that project. I know they did their homework. Why do they have a 0? Why? Because their brain is a little bit like Swiss cheese as it's still developing. So while they can do one complex thing over here, somehow they can't manage to remember to put the milk back in the refrigerator. And there are a lot of factors that both internally and externally for that. So one of the things that I always want people to understand, mental illness is rampant, and people will talk about mental health and mental illness interchangeably. Think about that. Mental health is about our health, it's about our wellness. And it's just like our physical health because it's all one system. If we don't eat well, if we don't get enough sleep, if we don't drink enough water, right? If we don't get any exercise, we're not going to be physically healthy. We can compensate with it for a while, but over time, that takes its toll. Our mental well-being is very much the same. If we don't have tools, if we don't have perspective and understanding, if we don't have some insulation, over time, life is going to continue to break down that wellness. But it really starts a lot of times in adolescence. By the age of 14, statistics tell us that 50% of mental illness in adulthood is already diagnosed by the age of 14, or at least diagnosable. That jumps up to 75% in that 18 to 24-year-old range. 75% of mental illness that will plague people in adulthood starts in 18 to 24. And if you think about what's happening in the 2/3 of adolescence before that last stage, where suddenly we're expected to be an adult even though our brain hasn't finished developing, we are reinforcing those negative self-perceptions. We are reinforcing, again, all of those negative coping skills, our difficulty communicating or knowing how to be assertive rather than compliant or aggressive or avoidant, right? So I have quite a few. I was actually really surprised when I started this coaching program. I expected mostly high schoolers, and about half in my first year, starting this coaching program, about half were between the ages of 18 and 21. Why? Because these were kids that were supposed to launch, right, to college or to some independent living, and they were coming home unable to function because they didn't know how to function without just being told what to do, that their very well-intended parents didn't know what they didn't know. And so these kids had a certain amount of anxiety because honestly, that's just developmental, right? That doesn't have to be pathological, but it became, for it to become like diagnosable, it has to really interfere with our level of functioning, right? With tools, most of the time we can push through it. But these kids weren't able to function. They couldn't hold a job. They couldn't stay in school. They were coming back home. And I looked into it a little bit deeper. And 20% of kids, quote unquote, fail when they try to launch. They are having to come home from college because they can't manage all the stressors. They can't manage all the demands on them. They can't manage the social piece. They're making unhealthy choices, getting themselves in bad situations for date rape or substance use, right? So they can still be focusing on developing those executive functioning skills that allow them to function as an adult. But that perspective of what really, expect a 22-year-old to have the level of responsibility and capability that a 30-year-old has is not realistic, even though they get lumped into that category. Because, well, you're in your 20s now, right? You're an adult now. You should do this. If we want them to be able to function like adults by the time they legally are, we need to be scaffolding that so that they have the tools to do it and they don't just fall on their face, right? They don't fail to fly when we kick them out of the nest or hold onto them so tightly that we don't really let them practice spreading their wings to leave the nest, right? A lot of parents, very well intended, they will mislabel their kids' behavior, right? I tell them you're misdiagnosing it all the time. What you call disrespect is emotional dysregulation. And your reaction to that perceived disrespect is then setting this up to create more conflict, more disconnection, more negative, internal self-talk, right? And what we're doing is we're teaching them to be compliant and follow directions, or we're teaching them to be sneaky. We want to teach them to be healthy and competent and know that they can trust themselves. And when they run into things, because none of us know everything, we all need resources sometimes, they know where they actually have that access. Parents mistakenly think that they want to raise compliant kids, right? That we want kids that are well behaved. We want respectful kids. And there is a difference, right? Because as these kids are reaching that 18 to their early 20s, if they don't have the tools, they can't function with what society is saying is an adult level. They're feeling like failures, and it's only reinforcing senses of helplessness or unworthiness or inability. And we want our kids to know that they don't have to know how to do it all, not even as young adults. We want them to know where to find resources, whether it's us, whether it's mentors, wherever that might be. That's a sign of competency and resiliency, is when we know how and when it's time to utilize our resources. But when our kids are adolescents, we have to help identify those resources, or we're not necessarily going to like it. But all too often, parents are calling their kids' behavior disrespectful, when really what it is dysregulated.
All I can say is wow. Again, I remember when we first had that conversation, all I could say is the word wow. And this has been so, so impactful. Again, hope and just bless that everyone listening and viewing to this episode really, really, again, like I said at the beginning, I know I said take one thing, but really take everything and really apply it tomorrow. Again, she said through, as she was walking us through that third and final stage of adolescence, 75%, of mental health is diagnosed between 18 and 24. Again, 75 is 3/4 of the world's population. And to
impact we can have on the mental health crisis,
right, and
if
to
we
kind of
actually
go
get
to
proactive
that,
and intervene.
it just reminds me of when I was that age. I'm only 28, so I literally just left that third final stage. But how many people, and whether it's dating, relationships, friendships, in the workplace, how many people, just especially if you're that age, or everyone has nieces, nephews, children, or friends, or coworkers that age. Just think about that. How many people when they're that age or even older, you're just kind of talking at a restaurant or wherever. How many people say, "Oh, I'm just like that," or I haven't. How many, 20 plus 30, 40-year-olds say, "Oh, I have anxiety. I've always had it," or I've always been shy, or I've always been timid, or that person that's always kind of hot headed and kind of always, takes everything disrespectfully, like Jim was saying. That's because they never learned those tools when they were, adolescents, and their parents just, again, I love that word compliance. Their parents just said, "Shut up and go to your room." And then, to Jen's point on those three stages, there comes a point where you can't just go to your room. When you go to work, it's called you're fired, right? It's called, if you don't pay your mortgage or your rent, it's called you're evicted and homeless, right? And I love that she's broke down those three stages, because as you go through those three stages and get older and go into adulthood, the consequences get more severe. It's not just, timeout or no video games for a week, right? It's, hey, now you can't eat, now you're on the street, or now you're, in jail, or even worse, right? So
Before my son started college, we had a parent orientation that was, remote. And this was 3 weeks before move-in day. He's, going to be a freshman in college. And they're making this laundry list of, make sure your kid, between now and when they move in, make sure that they know how to manage their money. Make sure they know how to do their laundry. Make sure they know how self-advocate and ask professors to help. Make sure they know how, and they're just giving this laundry list. And we were muted. And my husband was laughing at me, because I'm like, 3 weeks before they're ready to go to college is not when we teach them all of this. We start teaching them this by the time they're in middle school and high school. They're not going to absorb all of that and learn all of that in 3 weeks, right? And so we think about these milestones, and the milestones are important, but they don't happen overnight. The change is happening daily for years. We have that opportunity to intervene early, to scaffold that learning while we are still that safety net. While my son is now in college, I am still a safety net, and he knows that. but I'm not there with him, right? I'm not there to pick up on visual cues, except when he comes home, right? Or if we FaceTime. That's a big leap of faith for me. And as parents, we can feel really worried and really helpless. And what that will often do is either drive us to avoid because, ooh, this is really uncomfortable. So I'm just going to hope that this naturally evolves, or to become very controlling because you have to listen to me. I have to know that you're safe. And so we teach compliance and dependency, or we teach sneaky or aggressive, rebellious behavior. And our goal is to help them
Wow.
find
Well,
that balanced
again,
center.
everything that you're breaking down is just spot on. And it kind of reminded me of, when I was that 18 to 22-year-old range. And, everybody, one thing they always say is credit, right? Work on your credit, or, you should, learn how to manage money is another thing. It's like, we don't, at 18, I love how you said the 3 weeks, that's kind of how, right. And the reason I say
I
that
thought that was the
is,
most ridiculous thing
going
I'd ever
all the
heard.
way back to the beginning of the episode when I said committed versus convicted, how many of us, don't have those tools, and we don't teach our kids that tools. And again, 18, we say, all right, you got to figure it out, go to college, get a job, go to trade school, go to the military, or what you're going to do. And I know when she said that, I know some of you viewing and listening kind of laugh like that's ridiculous. But when you really look at it, we actually, some of us parents do it even worse. We say, hey, your birthday's next week, you turn 18. Have you decided where you want to go to college yet? Have you just, or right before they graduate high school, it's, 2 weeks before they walk the stage in that cap and gown. It's like, hey, you haven't decided, you haven't accepted your scholarship yet, or you haven't signed the intent to, enroll in the fall, or you haven't, got with your recruiter for the military, or, hey, when you turn 18, next month, you got to start looking for a job, or um, figuring out what you want to do. And we kind of give, to Jen's point, we kind of put it in the child's ball in the court too late. It's like, hey, and I really want to break that down real quick before we go into the next topic, just on the 3 stages of adolescence. And I really want the parents to really hone in and listen to this, or even if you're aunt or uncle and don't have kids of your own, really, if you look at the 3 steps that Jen has broken down here today, we go to ages, from 10 to 18, middle school, high school, almost to college. And we expect them, again, going back to what she was saying, we hold their hand, tell them to go to their room. You stay in the driver's seat for all those years, most of us. And at the
I also see where parents will back up. Well, they're teens now. They're basically young adults. No, they're not. They're adolescents. It is its own developmental stage. The teenage years are not when we want to
Exactly. And I
be
love the
hands
way you said
off.
that
We
too,
just want to change our
because
position.
again, we either abandon all hope and it's like, all right, you do what you want, or we get, too controlling. And then, like we said, we wait till they get to 18. It's like, all right, now you got it. And it's like, got what? Like, you didn't teach me anything to get. And it's kind of like, imagine if you handed a freshly 16, 18-year-old that just got their license, a brand new Porsche or Corvette with, no insurance on the car, and you just hand them the keys and you say, all right, go drive. What did you teach them what to do if they're, if they get a flat tire? Did you teach them, how to enroll in insurance, what insurance means? Did you teach them how to get gas? Do you know where the gas tank is in your car? Do you know what kind of gas your car takes? Do you know how to get an oil change? Do you know what to do if your car stops working? Do you have AAA coverage to get roadside assistance? That's just a quick example of, hey, we expect, hey, when are you going to hurry up and learn how to drive and get your license so you can get a car? And we don't teach our kids anything, the responsibilities or the tools, like Jen's been saying, to even take and handle the responsibility of owning a vehicle. And so that's just a quick, example of just one thing of adulthood that we kind of expect. I remember when I was, turning 16, it's like, all right, you got to get your permit, you got to get your license. When you turn, 17, 18, get out of high school, you got to get a car. And it's like, wait, I'm, new at this. I'm still learning how to drive. And so, um, I love everything you said thus far. Absolutely love it. It's been so impactful and so educational for all the listeners and viewers. And so, with that being said, to kind of go back um, And, as we've walked through these 3 stages, at the very beginning, you said you kind of nicknamed the teen whisperer. And, just through these 3 stages, I know you kind of seen, whether it's drug addiction, running away from home, acting out, lashing out, violent, etc. I really want you to break down, what is the mindset of when you worked with, they kind of call them the abandoned or the forsaken of society of like, hey, it's like, I can't, a lot of the parents and families, like, they're out of control. I can't do it anymore. They're kind of cast out from society or kind of, abandoned, if you will, like at least emotionally. What can you tell us that you learned from those experience, and what is some tools and as well as education that you would give parents that are kind of going through that currently?
So, for about the first 18, 20 years of my career, I worked with youth and families that were specifically in either the foster care or the social justice system, right? And those were the people that would be judged. Those were the people that had no resources. Not always, but the vast majority. And so it never occurred to me to go into private practice. It never occurred to me to develop a coaching program because I was like, well, these are the people that really need the help, right? These are the people that I help them access, affordable housing and job training and give them parenting support while also providing the therapy to really work through kind of those family dynamics and to give them better communication tools and emotional regulation tools to manage their big feelings. And then there were things in life that were happening. And so I stepped away from that. And when I opened my private practice, I realized this is pretty universal, actually. This exists everywhere. It's not people who are being court ordered. This exists everywhere. I worked with a few years ago. Perfect example of this is, kind of middle class family. They lived in an affluent neighborhood. They weren't super rich, but they lived in a good district. The daughter was sort of like the perfect child. She was a cheerleader. She was in honors classes. She was student council. She was in Girl Scouts. She was 16, I think. And, she's the kind of kid that most parents would look at and go, why can't my kid be like that? But the reality was, she was what I would call the shiny, happy people. Because beneath that shiny, happy exterior that everybody thought was so perfect, right? That ability to be a chameleon and be that compliant kid at home, she was sneaking out. She was self-harming. She was, challenging every rule. Mom read the self-help book. She listened to everybody's advice. She tried being her best friend. She tried tough love. And by the time I met them, Mom had laid down the whole my way or the highway kind of conversation. She had had it. Kid was, sneaking out, going to parties, dating older guys, high risk behavior. So by the time I met them, this girl was couch surfing. She was staying with friends. And Mom, of course, initially was like, I'm just done. You can have her. And then, of course, calmed down. And it was really important to her that she figure out how to reconnect with her daughter. What I didn't know when I started working with this girl was she already had an active suicide plan. She was ready to just die. And it was a solid plan. It wasn't just fleeting thoughts. She disclosed that to me several weeks later. But within less than a month, she was back home. Mom would go on these tirades of like 2 to 3 hour lectures to try and correct her kid's behavior. Now, you can imagine that didn't go so well. It was well intended. It came from a place of desperation, but it wasn't effective. And yeah, I gave Mom some tools, but I really, my work was focused on adolescents. And this girl, right, the conversations had improved. They were back home. We were really working on communication tools. We were working on her perspective, right, and what was happening to her and why, so that she could manage her choices and her self-perception more effectively. She tested Mom, right, because that's what adolescents will do. So about maybe 6 weeks into our work together, things have really improved. She's back home. Conflicts have been pretty minimal. She decided to go spend the night at a friend's house, and they snuck out. They went to a party. She got drunk. And to test Mom, she tells me, I need to tell my mom. Part of me wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt of, oh, look at you being responsible and accountable. And I do think that there was a part of her testing that muscle that she was developing. But I think it was also a little bit to test, is Mom going to go back to that old way? But because she can't control Mom, but she could control using her communication tools. I call it the order of operations, the framework for it I call HEARTS, to make it more accessible to help them remember it. And within less than 2 minutes, she was able to use her tools, which cut Mom off. Mom felt heard. Mom felt understood. Mom did not need to go on a 3-hour lecture to make sure that she was getting through. That's how effective those communication skills were. She is now a young adult. She has a young child of her own. She's gone on to college, and she is studying to become a counselor because she wants to join the revolution to raise a healthier generation. But she told me when she sent me, this always gets me, she sent me a picture of her family at her high school graduation. And that's when she told me that it wasn't just about reaching that stage with her family, with that shiny, happy, not just being a plastic exterior anymore, but that she was even still alive to have reached that milestone. And had she not started working with me, she would have taken her own life.
Again, I just want, everyone listening, viewing to really just, again, just sit on that for a few seconds. And again, this is the reason why we do this work, whether it's, private practice, social work, whether it's podcasting. Again, this stuff is real. And so again, I want, as I, slowly speak, kind of really want, again, this is, why I love, podcasting and, spreading the word, because we've all been there, whether it's, actually, while we're on that topic, about 2 days prior to the inception of the Darklaw Dominion mental health series, one of my football teammates and really close friends that I called a brother, a year prior to the start of the podcast, this series, we were in Florida on a football tournament at an Airbnb, having fun, talking the whole night, playing football. And we actually planned a birthday trip for the next year, which was the debut of the podcast series, to go to Amsterdam because he'd always wanted to go to Europe. And 2 days before the Darklaw Dominion mental health series launched, he had, at 29, took his own life and left a 4-year-old daughter behind. And again, this was just this past last year, at the start. And I share that, I've shared before previously on an episode, but I share that with all of you to really understand that I had already, again, the podcast had already started the previous January. I had already thought I had it all planned. I had the date before I even knew any of this would happen. I had already had the date of the podcast to launch. And then the day after the podcast launch, that was his birthday. And I really want everyone listening and viewing to understand just a year, 365 days had passed. 365 days prior, we're laughing and maybe had a couple beers, joking, staying up all night, playing our favorite sport and talking about, hey, it was like 4 or 5 of us friends. We're all going to take a a guys trip to Amsterdam. We'd all, never been to Europe. And again, 365 days later, he's no longer with us, on, at least on Earth. And so, again, this stuff is real, y'all. And, that's why, at the beginning, Jen talked about proactiveness. How many, I love at the very beginning when she was going through her background, she said, I got tired of being on the soapbox and I got convicted and wanted to build a program. How many times are you just going to sit on your phone and scroll through Facebook and see, stories of suicide, or, hey, I went to high school with that guy. He, took his own life, or, I worked with that guy, or, hey, I just saw her last week at Kroger. Again, this stuff is real and we have to do what we can, use our abilities to help others. And again, I appreciate you, Jen, for sharing that story. And that just really, hyphenized and really highlighted, the importance of, the work that, we're all striving to do. Again, as, we went through this wonderful episode. It's not just, hoorah talk, like I said, at the beginning. It's not just motivation. It's not just, hey, you have to parent this way. Teenagers, I said, you have to live like this. It's really to, hey, how can we help them become the best version of themselves in a healthy way and be balanced? The goal is balanced. It's one of my favorite books by Simon Sinek is The Infinite Game, because we're all finite players in an infinite game. Nobody's a finished product, no matter the age or no matter the expertise or the wisdom. And so all we can do is share those tools and help each other, really get to the level that we need to get to. And so with that being said, Jen, I really want to ask, now that you've, had these experience all these years, growing up, obviously you're married with kids that are adolescents. How did that affect your family? Kind of seeing you, become a warrior of social justice and work and really helping others. And how did that impact, your kids growing up as well?
I think, like most things, there are good aspects and there are drawbacks. So my son is the oldest, and when he was probably my best teacher, right? Because I'd done this already for quite a while by the time my kids reached adolescence. And he was that lovely reminder that living it is a different experience, right? So, and he's not going to listen to me the way that my clients listen to me. In fact, I had a teenager when he was really little. I had a teenager I was working with say, when your kids are my age, they're not going to listen to you or they're not going to tell you stuff the way we tell you stuff. I'm like, I know. So he was my reminder, right? That I get to be the expert as the mom, but I'm not the expert as the teen whisperer. That said, I knew a lot more than most parents. So there were humbling moments for sure that I would find myself stepping into all the traditional parenting traps. I'd find myself coming home, tired. I've had a lot of clients struggling with suicidality. So my therapy approach is not super traditional in terms of my availability to my clients. And there was a particular rough patch. So my bandwidth was pretty limited. And my son was just kind of, getting into middle school and finding his own voice, and it could piss me off. Like I'd come home after a long day of work and he wouldn't have done his chore and he wouldn't have done his homework and whatever, and I'd be like, why can't you just? And I'm like, I know better than to say these things. And sometimes he would say, you're just trying to therapize me. So we still joke about that term because he would make up his own words. But there was also more trust that I knew what I was going to say. And he would tell me things going on with his friends. And my favorite is I would kind of try to come in the side door with him with dropping those little nuggets of advice. And it'd be like, yeah, I got this. I'm good. But then I'd go and hear him talking to a friend and he would repeat what I had said. So I knew that he was listening, but I had to know how to approach him. And I initially stepped into some of those parenting traps. My daughter's a different beast than my son. So she's much closer. She's naturally a little more on the compliance side. So I would tell her, don't apologize for that. Make a mistake. Don't get a perfect grade. Don't go that other direction. That's not healthy either. And her freshman year, there was a queen bee, right? And the girl drama kicked in. We'd also lost both of my parents recently, who, those were her people. We're very, very close. And my father-in-law had died. My brother had died not, a few years before that. So they'd had a lot of loss. And so between this and transitioning into high school, where she didn't have any friends because we didn't go to our district school, and then all of the girl drama, it was just a lot all at once. And, she was much more reactive, much more withdrawn. And one time, again, luckily my kids absorbed a lot of these tools along the way. And one time she told me, she's like, I just need you to listen. I don't want advice. And so again, humbling, right? Stop stepping in those traps, Mom. And she came to me one day when I'd been practicing just listening, asking questions, not trying to protect her because that was, of course, my mama bear instinct. And she came to me and she said, I've watched you develop this program for teens. And I know that you help because I listen to some of the stories. I don't give any identifying information, but, I know you help. Do you think it would be okay for me to do it? And of course, I said yes, but I also told her, and I know that you need to hear other voices. It can't just be me. So I found her a mentor. Unfortunately, she didn't get as much from the mentor as she did from me, but it was still a safe space for her to kind of explore and to reinforce and double check those messages, right? And to grow and to kind of get to work through some of that social stuff in real time with peers rather than just, it being theory. And that was really important. And,
Awesome.
she's thriving.
Again, I'm, glad everything worked out. And really all I gotta say is just be persistent and be convicted. Again, your children are watching. whether you know it or not. And I love that you said your son was repeating the advice you gave him to his friends, and you had no idea. You're thinking he's just, oh, mom, would you be quiet? You're always giving advice, or you're always preaching, or whatever terminology you want to use. And really just want to encourage you all to really just don't give up on your kids, and really just, again, like I said at the beginning, are you committed? Are you convicted? And really encourage you to be convicted. And, I'll say this last thing, and I'll let Jen tell us where she can find us and any last minute tips or tools or inspirations she has. And I'll just say this and let her roll with that. Your children are your legacy, whether it's the bloodline or however you want to, the lineage, whatever terminology you want to use for that. And you also have a duty, any information or any inspiration that you could give someone, and you owe it to yourself to reach one and teach one. And so just encourage everyone to finish your story. It all ends and begins with you. And as long as you step up and do your part in this life, you have to just, have faith and, let everything else work itself out. And so I just want everyone to be encouraged. Don't give up on the children. And again, this has been a great episode 12. Again, share it with your folks. Even if you're just listening and passing, like and share. Again, 75% of mental illness in adolescents is diagnosed between 18 and 24. Just some of those stats, really just encourage everyone to be encouraged and keep on keeping on. And so with that, Jen, tell us any last minute tools or resources or education that you have, and then also tell the audience where they can find your coaching program and you on social media.
I can talk on this stuff for hours, right? There's a lot to it. But one thing I will just tell parents, it's not about perfection. It is about being proactive. Being proactive just means that you keep showing up every day, that you keep trying to understand what's happening with your teens rather than filling in the storylines of what you think is happening. So it's hard to break it down to like one piece of advice, but I get asked that a lot. So if I give one piece of advice to parents, it's be curious rather than react, rather than talk at, rather than assume. Be curious, because when that curiosity is authentic, our kids communicate with us. And when they communicate with us, anything is possible.
Awesome. And then where can they find your coaching and your...
The easiest way to find me is through Facebook. And I know not everybody uses Facebook, but I have a private Facebook group for parents called Proactive Parenting, where I'll give free trainings and resources and drop tips. And it's just a place because we all need a tribe, right? There's a lot to parenting adolescents, and we all need our own support system. So parents can always find me there. My program itself is for adolescents. They are welcome to go to my website or email me, and that's jencanobbiocoaching.com or jencanobbiocoaching.com. So parents are welcome to reach out. I do free solution calls. So you've got that one thing, right? I just want my kid to listen to me. I actually can deliver that to you in about 20 minutes. So I give free solution calls. Parents are welcome because, to kind of go back to something you said a little bit ago, every kid is unique, but their problems, right, and our problems in parenting are pretty universal. And so we get to sometimes take that step back to say, developmentally, our teens are all going through the same thing. But we want to be sure that we're equipping them, right? Because my program, it's a 12-week program. I kind of extend it for some of the youth. And I break down, self-love is some ethereal term, right, that people use. But the reality is there are 6 pillars to self-love. And those are all very concrete, skill-based pillars. And that develops our sense of self. Right? And that's the foundation for any other relationship in our life. I teach effective communication. I teach them how to manage all the social stuff. For some, it's how do I manage my anxiety so that I can show up and make a friend. For some of them, it's, how do I manage that queen bee and navigate all the social drama or the pressure to fit in? Because this is all very real, given what's happening in the teenage brain. I do give them tools to manage those executive functioning, right? So that they're not procrastinating, developing, those bad habits. That they're managing all of the stress, they're managing, the dynamics at home so that they can show up and actually feel connected to their parents, and the parents feel connected rather than engaging.
Again, it's been a wonderful exciting episode 12 here in season 2. Again, I'll have all that in the episode description when the episode goes live. Again, hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their night. And remember, it all ends and begins with you, and you have the ability to decree the dominion of your mind to reveal the true light that shines. And, just keep on keeping on. Be curious, be proactive, and be convicted in your family legacy. And so this has been Dominion and Jen Canobbio from the hills on the other side of the Bay Area. Until next time on Decree of Dominion. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on this journey into the depths of Darklaw Dominion. Remember, it's in the darkest parts of ourselves that we often find the greatest strength. Facing that darkness is not a sign of weakness, it's the path to healing, growth, and reclaiming control of your life. If this series resonates with you, or if you're looking for more empowering stories on healing and reclaiming your power, make sure to follow Decree of Dominion on Facebook, Spotify, and YouTube. There, we continue the conversation on mental health, domestic violence, and relationships, offering hope and support. Until next time, keep exploring the shadows, keep seeking your truth, and keep fighting for your light.